to a very special online Cathedral service. I'm coming to you here in downtown Flint, but wherever you are, whether you're here in the city, somewhere else, or another part of the country, we hope that this service blesses you and that you have a great holiday weekend. Hope that you're enjoying time with your friends and family as you get away, and maybe a hot dog or two. Before we get into our message this morning, there's a couple quick preliminaries that I want to go over with you to make sure that you are aware of everything that we've got coming down the pipeline this month. We've got two great events that are happening. The first is, if you go to our website, thecathedral.is, right on our main page you see a big red icon that says Serve Day 16. On July 16th, so just less than 2 weeks away, we are having our second annual Serve Day. We're partnering with, as of today, over 258 churches all around the country that are committed to doing one thing on July 16th, and that is serving their city and loving with the love of Jesus in a tangible way. And so if you're interested in getting involved in that, even if you're not a part of the Cathedral, maybe you go to a different church and you want to get your church involved, we are more than welcome, the more the merrier. And so you can go online, find out details about Serve Day 16 on there, and contact us if you'd like to get involved. The second thing is on July 31st, after our morning service, we are doing our second annual baptism celebration and picnic. We are going to be joining people that are taking their next step in their walk with Jesus by publicly declaring that they're intending to follow Jesus through water baptism. We're also going to be hanging out, enjoying some good food, some good company, and taking communion early church style. So it's going to be a great time. I would encourage you to come out, enjoy the sunshine with us. It's going to be at Bluebell Beach at Pavilion number 2, and it's going to be absolutely wonderful. Well, I want to welcome you to week number 3 in our summer series that we're calling With Honor. I've been enjoying this series so much, and I hope that you have too. If you're not a part of our church, or maybe you've missed the last couple weeks, make sure to go online, thecathedral.is. You can also check out our iTunes podcast and catch the last couple Sundays to kind of bring yourself up to speed. But there's a couple things real quick, kind of preliminaries, that I want to go over when talking about this whole subject of honor. Honor is something which is becoming increasingly kind of foreign in our culture. I've kind of joked during this series that it's one of those things where the only time that you hear about honor is when we're talking about knights in the Middle Ages or Klingons on Star Trek. But honor is a crucial component, especially in the life of the Christian. The Bible displays and talks about honor repeatedly throughout the scriptures. And we see the definition of honor, as we see in the scriptures, when we see the word honor translated into English, because we know that the Bible wasn't originally written in English. The Old Testament was in Hebrew, the New Testament was in Greek. And the words that are used there that translate into English as honor mean essentially taking something of value, making it, considering it weighty, or considering it of worth. On the flip side of that, to dishonor something is really to consider it light, to not take it seriously, to disrespect, to profane. And the Bible talks to us very clearly about the fact that every single person in creation is due some level of honor and some respect. We kind of set the stage in that in the first week, that because of the very fact that we're created in the image of God, when we honor somebody else, we're actually honoring God in return. Additionally, last week we talked about the subject of authority, what it means to have authority in over us in different areas of our lives, and even a little bit of what it means to possess authority and to have people honor us in that position of authority, what that means. Over the next several weeks, including this morning, we're going to talk about different areas specifically and how we can honor and speak life and honor and respect into those areas of our lives. In week 6, we're going to begin wrapping the series up by talking and dealing with the subject of harsh authority, what it means when you're confronted with a situation where you're supposed to give honor according to the Bible, but that person isn't very honorable, or maybe they're out for their own personal gain, or whatever the case may be. In some situations, there's even downright abusive spiritual authority or civic authority, and we have to learn as the family of God how we respond and how we act in situations like that. So I would encourage you, make sure to come out in week 6, and then we're going to wrap up the series in week 7, talking about rewards for honor and how we live a life of honor and what God does to bless us as a result of that. Before we get into the blessings, before we get into the whole subject of the consequences of whether or not we honor somebody, I think it's important whenever we talk about something behavioral that we make sure that we understand our motivation. The Bible is very clear that actions are important, but that the motivation behind those actions is actually even more important. I'll give you an example. We see in 1 Corinthians when Paul is addressing the subject of giving. When he's talking about giving, he doesn't just say that God loves a giver. God loves someone who gives. No, he says that God loves a cheerful giver. And he goes on to say that each person should make up in their mind what they're supposed to give, not reluctantly, not under compulsion, but between them and the Holy Spirit. So the motivation, what happens in the heart, is actually more important than what happens in the hand. So our actions are driven by our motivations. When our motivations are right, God is pleased. I'll give you another example. In the Old Testament, throughout the prophets, we see God speak to and give correction to the Israelites in situations responding to their sin. But often, we see him actually address not even their conduct, but the heart behind their conduct, that their hearts had turned away from him. He was intimately concerned with whether or not they were being faithful as his people in their heart. In fact, in Isaiah, there's several times where he speaks to the subject of the fact that the Israelites were continuing to fast to God, but their hearts weren't in the right place. So when we look at this subject like honor, it's important that we understand that we don't show honor to people so God will bless us, or we don't show honor to people, we don't live a life of honor to avoid God getting mad at us or facing judgment or consequences. Both of those are true. We do face consequences for living a life of dishonor, and when we do choose to honor, especially in circumstances where it's difficult, God blesses us. But those are byproducts. They're not the end game of why we choose to honor. Instead, I believe that our motivation should instead be living a life of honor because we love God and because we know his purposes are best for our lives, for our society, and in the world. And it's probably best that we do things his way, seeing as how he's the creator. Whenever we get a new piece of equipment or an appliance or something like that, and we don't know how to use it, we ultimately go back to the instructions. We look to what the manufacturer says the intended purpose for that appliance or that piece of equipment is. And the same is true with creation. We understand our purpose, the reason for which we were created best, by going back to why we were created and who we were created by. So I'm just crazy enough to think that our lives, yours and mine, our society, both here in Flint, in other parts of the United States, and around the world, our civilization would function best under an attitude and a posture of honor. Today we're actually going to be addressing the subject of honoring civic leadership. We're going to be talking about our government authority that's placed over us, that we elect into authority, and some, when you look at like the Supreme Court and stuff like that, who are not elected but are chosen by our elected officials. We're going to look at what it means to live a life where we honor those who God has placed in authority. Remember last week we talked about the fact that all authority comes from God. The Bible is very clear about that. We also said that all authority is not necessarily godly, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But it's important first to remember that all authority comes from God. I'll give you an example pertaining specifically to government authority. In Romans chapter 13, Paul says to the Romans, "For rulers are not to be feared by those who do good, but by those who do evil. Would you like to be unafraid of authority? Then do what is good, and they will praise you, because they are God's servants working for your own good. But if you do evil, then be afraid of them, because their power to punish is real." Here's where it gets interesting. They are God's servants. They are God's servants. Not some of them, all of them. They are God's servants, and they carry out punishment on those who do evil. And for this reason, he's talking about the fact that they're God's servants. This is the reason. You must obey authorities, not just because of God's punishment. That's not the primary motivation, but also as a matter of conscience, a matter of the heart. This is why you pay taxes, because the authorities are working for God when they fulfill their duties. Pay them what you owe them. Pay them your personal and property taxes, and here we go. Show respect and honor for them all. For them all. And so it's important that we understand Paul is saying here that all authority has come from God, and pertaining specifically to civic authority, that we are to show respect and honor for everyone in a position of government. Now, I know the natural inclination, especially for us as Americans, is to kind of balk at that idea and say, well, what about those who don't hold biblical principles? What about those, I didn't vote for that person, I honor no man except for God. Well, that's actually not biblical. The Bible actually is very clear that when we honor man, we're honoring God. When we dishonor man, we dishonor God. And it's very clear that when we look at the context, remember, Paul is not writing to in some Christian nation. He's not writing in this little vacuum of Christian bubbles in like a theology classroom or a seminary. No, he's writing to the Church of Rome. The emperor at this time was Nero. The emperor at this time was not a Christian, far from a culture which upheld biblical values. In fact, at this time, many Christians were being put to death for their faith by government authorities, both local and nationally. And so it's important that we keep that in mind when Paul is saying respect and honor them all, that they are God's servants, that we remember the context to which he's speaking, which is far worse than anything that we could face in our day. One of the reasons why that's the case, one of the reasons, probably the primary reason I would say that we show honor specifically to our government authorities is because of the representation that we give for the gospel. You know, whenever you and I speak, 2 Corinthians, Paul says that we're ambassadors of reconciliation. That means that we are here on this earth, in this country, in the city in which you are, as an ambassador representing heaven. That means our actions, both good and bad, have an influence on how people view our home country. You think about the fact that if the German ambassador were to be in the United States and were to just act a fool, do a bunch of crazy stuff, it would influence the way that we view our relationship with Germany. Same is true with any other foreign nation, or if an American ambassador were to go to a foreign nation, get plastered drunk at an event with a bunch of dignitaries and embarrass himself in front of civic leaders of other nations, it would have an influence, it would impact the relationship in the way that America is viewed because that ambassador represents that country. The same is true here in our situation. You and I are ambassadors of a country called heaven. And that's where our primary citizenship lies. So when we choose in this foreign land to conduct ourselves in a certain way, it influences the reputation of the gospel. And that's true right here in the scriptures. We see Paul actually say this to Timothy, that a reputation for those outside the church, it should be a concern of us inside the church. He tells Timothy that church leaders must have a good reputation and be thought well of by those outside the church, lest that he become involved in slander, incur reproach, and fall, what Paul says, into the devil's trap. That's 1 Timothy 3:7. So Paul's saying here that when we actually incur a poor reputation because of our conduct, it impinges on the gospel. It's slanderous. It slanders the name of the gospel, and it's actually working with the enemy. So when we choose to dishonor civic leaders, when we speak disrespectfully or slanderously, when we overtly criticize them to such a degree that it becomes demeaning and disrespectful, then we're actually slandering the gospel and we're working and coinciding with the kingdom of Satan. And so that's huge. And that's important for us as followers of Jesus to really let sink down into our hearts that our conduct, the way that we treat, the way that we speak about and to government authorities actually matters in light of the gospel. We see the first century Christians really live this out. In fact, one of our early manuscripts that we have in history that's outside of the biblical canon is what's called the letter to Diognetus. And it was written by an unbeliever in the city of Rome observing the Christians that Paul was writing to in that day. This person said this about Christians, that they pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven, meaning they're in the world, they're there. They pass their days here, but ultimately they recognize that their citizenship is in heaven. They go on to say they obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time, they surpass the laws by their lives. So they didn't do just a mandatory minimum of getting by and what was required, but they went above and beyond to show honor to the land and to the country, to the leaders that were over them. And hear me when I say this. I believe that it's possible to both take a stand for what we believe to be right and to do so while honoring civic authority, while speaking respectfully to those that God has placed over us. In our culture today, we often kind of get a little bit jumbled, this idea that it's impossible to love or to honor or to respect someone, to demonstrate and live out those principles while disagreeing. We view the two as the same, that disagreement equals hate, that disagreement equals dishonor or disrespect. And that's not true. In fact, that's not true at all. So I would say this, to answer this question, because I know I would have this question, how do I appropriately honor civic leaders in my context? How do here today, okay, we can throw out some scriptures, a history lesson, yada, yada, but what does it mean for me to honor, how do I know that I'm appropriately honoring my civic leaders? That's a great question, and I would say that we answer that with another question that we ask ourselves, and it's this: can I speak to that government official? Can I speak to that president, that mayor, that governor, whoever it may be, the way that I speak about them and still show them the love of Jesus. The confrontational types will jump in on that first part where they say, I'll speak to them exactly how I speak about them. But we can't leave out the last part and still show them the love of Jesus. Would you be able to end that conversation praying for them? Not just that they will turn from their wicked ways, but that God would bless their family, that he would protect them, that he would give them wisdom, that he would give them guidance. Can you pray love over them? Can you demonstrate the love of Jesus? If the answer is no, then probably some correction is in order for the way that we honor that government official. And so what I would say is this. When we look at the words of Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, where Peter instructs us and does so very blatantly, very obviously, and it's hard, you can't really twist this and get around it and kind of excuse it away. Peter actually makes a statement that we should be subject to, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, not just the ones that we like, not just the people that we voted for, but every human institution, whether it's the emperor as supreme. And once again, Peter's talking about honoring Nero, the killer of Christians, the one who burned Rome and blamed all the Christians for it, killed one of Peter's closest friends, James, the brother of John, and ultimately approved Peter's execution himself. This is the kind of emperor that Peter is talking about being subject to the governors that are sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is God's will, that by doing good, we should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. That means that when we do good, when we honor, when we submit ourselves, even in times when it's difficult, that God honors it and our reputation honors the gospel of Jesus Christ. That we represent as ambassadors the good news of Jesus well. Live as people who are free, but not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. And here he makes these final statements. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, which he's talking about the church, fear God, and then he wraps it up one more time, as if once weren't enough. Honor the emperor. Honor the emperor. This is the kind of conduct that Peter's talking about. This is the kind of attitude that Peter's talking about, once again, in a government situation which was exceptionally hostile towards what he was preaching. Peter is saying, as ambassadors of this king, be subject to those that God has placed in authority while we wait for the return of our king. So I would give you this. Now, how do we deal with leaders who conduct themselves dishonorably or with those with whom we disagree? The first is I would look to the example of Daniel. We see Daniel after the land decreed that he was not allowed to pray to anyone except the king himself. Daniel still committed to praying to the king, but conducted himself in an honorable fashion. So much so that when it came time for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions, that the king mourned that he had to do that because of the way that Daniel treated the king. We recognize that all authority is of God, even though some authority is not godly. And God commands us, God beckons us to be honorable, to be respectful to those who he's placed in authority. So what does that mean for us today? Here in 2016, we're in the middle of a high-charged and what has been an extremely disrespectful and dishonorable election season. On both sides of the aisle, from every which way, there's mud, there's dishonor, there's disrespect, there's just outright nonsense that's being propagated. How do we as the family of God respond to that? And I believe it's this. I believe that God is calling us, as the people of God, to lead the way in demonstrating what it's like to live a life where we show honor to those who are in authority, even the ones that may act foolishly at times, even the ones that may act dishonorably at times, and even the ones that don't propagate biblical values. God's calling us to demonstrate lives where we show honor and respect in the midst of disagreement. I believe one of the things our culture needs now more than ever is for a people group to be willing to rise up and to lead the way, showing how you can disagree and not be disagreeable. I believe here in our city, in Flint, where we have the Flint water crisis, there's a lot of mistrust in government. There's a lot of mistrust in all sorts of areas, and different factions within the city blame different elected officials and all of that kind of stuff. But it's important that in the midst of that the people of God, if we claim to follow Jesus, that we recognize our duty to honor those that God has placed in authority. I will say this, as the pastor of the Cathedral, Tara and I love and respect and pay honor to our government leadership. We thank you. Those that God has placed and entrusted in authority over our city and our state, we honor you and we thank you. And I want to say personally that we're praying for you. And so I think that we as the people of God here in Flint, I love what the early church used to refer to the church in specific cities. They would say the colony of God in Flint or the colony of God in some other city. we as the people in this city have an obligation to honor those that God has entrusted, to see beyond just the position and to see a person that God is intimately concerned with.